Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Well, welcome to WCED, Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, in this roundtable we're having today on the subject of authoritarian crisis and adaptation. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. And the basic idea for the roundtable today, we have three very different speakers coming from very different perspectives, work on different regions of the world, but I think all of whom will help us in some way start to think, hopefully in some new ways, about how authoritarian regimes adapt to changing circumstances. I think those of us who study authoritarian regimes would hopefully agree that a lot of the literature, a lot of the conversation focuses on the questions of why do authoritarian regimes endure, and why do they collapse? And there's a lot of focus on authoritarian, the question of how these regimes end or don't end. And a lot of times we conflate the idea of a durable regime with a stable regime, kind of implying that all an authoritarian regime has to do to stay in power is to keep things the same. But of course the world is constantly changing, there are new challenges, there are lots of things going on outside of the control of these authoritarian regimes. And so it seems like a good moment to think a little bit about how the question of, and maybe start to think a little bit more theoretically and generally about how it is that authoritarian regimes confront crises. When they do, how do they adapt? When do they succeed at adapting? When do they fail to adapt? And maybe give a little bit different perspective on the problem of authoritarian regimes per se. So without further ado, let me just briefly introduce our three speakers. We're very, very fortunate to have all three of them with us today. I'll introduce them in the order they'll be speaking. First, we'll be hearing from Victor Shi. Victor is the Ho Mui Lam Chair Professor in China and Pacific Relations at the University of California at San Diego. He's the author of the book from Cambridge University Press entitled Factions and Finance in China, Elite Conflict and Inflation. And his second book, entitled Economic Shocks and Authoritarian Stability, is soon to be published by the University of Michigan Press. More to the point, it's soon to be published in the new WCED book series at the University of Michigan Press. So great to have Victor here talking about that volume. Victor is also the author of numerous articles in academic and business journals, such as the American Political Science Review, the China Quarterly, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Politics, Wall Street Journal, and China Business Review. Following up on Victor, we'll be hearing from Andrea Kendall-Taylor. Andrea is a senior fellow and the director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Andrea is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Her work has been published in numerous political science and policy journals, including the Journal of Peace Research, Democratization, Journal of Democracy, Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, Washington Quarterly, and Foreign Policy. Andrea was also she got her PhD at UCLA and was a Fulbright scholar in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. And last but certainly not least, our very own Ann Pitcher will be speaking. Ann is a professor in the departments of political science and Afro-American and African studies here at the University of Michigan. She studies the comparative politics of developing countries, especially those in Africa. Her current research examines party politics, urban political economy, state business relations, and goods provision under authoritarian and democratic conditions. And she recently received a grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York to study election-related violence in Africa. So we've got a real powerhouse panel. Thank you all for coming out, and looking forward to hearing first comments from Victor Shi.
It's great to be here. My presentation today owes a lot to Dan, who not only did he contribute an excellent chapter in this edited volume on Malaysia and Indonesia, also this volume has successfully been listed on Amazon, which is the same as being published, under his guiding hand as the series editor in the University of Michigan Press for this book. So I'm going to briefly introduce some of the main findings of this edited volume, followed by some discussion of implications of what that means for democracies. So let's see if this works. Yeah. So first of all, just briefly go over some existing views on authoritarian regimes during economic shocks. Right. So the question is, what happens when there's an economic crisis? Do authoritarian regimes survive them or not? Right, so that's the traditional questions that a lot of comparative theorists have asked. So first of all, there's a large literature which looks at some static features of authoritarian regimes. So static as in relatively unchanging over time institutional features. Whether or not a regime has a party, so ruling party, that's oftentimes a big institutional features that people point to. Whether or not there's an authoritarian legislature, that's another institutional features a lot of theorists have pointed to. Another strand in the literature looks at crises specifically. So the literature has long noticed that during an economic crisis, there are moments of risk for the regimes because members of the ruling coalitions face sharply reduced payoffs, right? So by its nature, economic crises will take money. So literally will take money away from the oligarchs or senior level officials who help the dictator govern a regime. That will create incentives potentially for them to defect, right? So this is one of the questions in the Haggard and Kaufman volume from a few years ago. And the risks would be especially high if dictators rule with a minimum winning coalition as suggested by major theories of autocracy, right? So there's some of you who are more familiar with the game theory strand of the literature will know that in the game theory literature, oftentimes the winning coalition of the dictators oftentimes is casted as a minimum winning, i.e. the minimum necessary for the dictator to maintain in order to stay in power. But if that's the case, how can any dictatorship weather an economic crisis, which by definition will take resources away from members of his or her winning coalition? Because of the high risk of regime collapse during crisis, dictators are compelled to liberalize. So another strand of literature, as typified by the book done by Acemoglu and Robinson, would predict that during an economic crisis or any kind of crisis, the dictator will try to stay in power by actually liberalizing, by granting rights, additional rights to the population. But empirically, is that what we see in reality? And then finally, of course, the extant literature, I think, has always focused on the dichotomy between surviving an economic shock and not surviving an economic shock, and just basically have regime collapse, right? So I think our volume cannot comprehensively answer any of these questions, but provide empirical evidence to challenge almost every single one of these existing sort of wisdoms in the field. So first of all, what we find when we focus on established autocracies like China, Russia, pre-democratization Taiwan, Iraq, Iran, Jordan, some of the Eastern European regimes, Malaysia and Indonesia prior to the Asian financial crisis, the main outcomes after an economic shock was not regime collapse, right? So contrary to maybe the hopes of some of the earlier theorists, was not economic collapse. The main outcomes were either status quo, i.e. the regimes can survive economic crises quite well without changing anything, or a change in the ruling coalition, of the composition and also the benefits that are received by the ruling coalitions. And that actually challenges a lot of the existing wisdom, because if you have a minimum winning coalition, how can a realignment and how can taking resources away from the ruling coalition allow the regime to survive even better, right? When faced with a harder budget constraint during an economic crisis, dictators often contracted the ruling coalition and reduced benefits to the remaining members of the coalition. And instead of liberalizing during a crisis, dictators were far more likely to deploy additional repression and increase the use of propaganda, right? So even though people like Treisman are now really talking about this, looking at economic crisis and at the same time deploying these other tactics to stay in power was never really combined in any, at least in the game theory literature, was not seen together. And I think this volume suggests that maybe people should begin to look at these things in conjunction with each other. Okay, so we do have some kind of, besides problematizing some of the existing literature, we do have more sort of affirmative part of our argument, which is we argue that three variables deserve further theoretical and empirical investigation in the future. And these are the duration of the crisis, which is at least partially exogenous, right? So you say, well, duration of crisis is very endogenous. Obviously China didn't really have a big financial crisis in 2008 because they control the banking sector and they just, immediately launch a stimulus. But in many cases, actually, the duration was exogenous. For example, when it's the case of imposing externally imposed economic sanctions, especially by the United States, and these are kind of external shocks to regimes. And the reason why duration matters is because it will shape the expectation of the ruling coalition about their future stream of payment, right? So it's one thing if you expect the crisis to be a very short one. So you may miss a $10 payment today, but you still expect $100 in future payments forever onward. But if you expect the crisis to be a really long one because of credible sanctions, then you're going to miss, hundreds and hundreds of dollars of future income potentially. So these two, we would argue, is actually very different. The degree of financial control, something that I've done a lot of research on, but the financial control is not just the state controlling all the major financial institutions, which certainly is the case with China, but also the balance of payment, right? So in Eastern European cases, the state also owned all the banks, but because they ran very prolonged periods of balance of payment deficits, when the Soviet subsidies stopped coming in the late 1980s, many of these Eastern European regimes found themselves in very big difficulties and soon after sort of collapsed. We agree that authoritarian parties provide insiders with expectation of future payoffs and thus encourage them to protect the status quo. So our book by no means fundamentally challenged the institutional perspective, certainly not with a lot of our contributors, but we think that it's worthwhile to look at these static institutional features in interaction with some of the more dynamic variables such as the duration of the crises and other external factors. Okay. So there's a lot of interaction. So I'm not going to go through this basically complicated chart, but you can basically summarize. I mean, the basic intuition behind this table is just that the more of these features that you have in favor of the regime, the more likely the regime is to survive a crisis without changing the status quo, right? So you can imagine if a regime had the upper left corner, very strong party, very strong control over the financial sector, and if the duration of the shock is a short one, there's no reason whatsoever for regime insiders to defect. And so the most likely outcome is status quo. On the other hand, lower right-hand corner, if you have a long shock, which is combined with a very weak authoritarian party and also weak control of the financial system, either because of balance of payment difficulties or because financial institutions are owned by foreigners or something like that, then the chance of a regime change or at least a change in the status quo ruling coalition is very likely. So in the case of Jordan, which we have written by Tom Yum, very interesting case where Jordan was on the verge of collapse. The monarchy there had run a huge balance of payment deficit, ran up all this debt, and so the kingdom actually radically reoriented its support coalition and began to rely on external finances even more, but promising certain strategic favors, let's say, in return. And it was able to maintain power. But what Sean shows is that as a result of this change, the main supporters of the regime totally changed from a more local tribal support base to a more international support base. And arguably, it's even more fragile today because, if Trump decides to stop all aid or whatever to Jordan, the kingdom could face great difficulties immediately. Okay. Just very quickly, some of the I think highlight a few cases in a volume. So the Russia case is, so even before 2014, before the sanctions, Russia had a lot of economic difficulties, but certainly after the sanctions, it faced even greater difficulties. which forced, by the way, it to devalue its currency by like over 50%. That's a massive, massive shock. It, caused all kinds of problems, high inflation, capital flight, you name it. Russia had it all. But Putin stayed in power. So how did he do it? I think one dimension is that a lot of the oligarchs, their money was already outside of Russia, so they didn't care what happened to Russia. In a sense, it's like they keep their money either way, even if there's a big economic shock in Russia. But within Russia, Putin totally ramped up patriotic propaganda and used social media to direct public opinion against the United States and other enemies of Russia to great success, right? So that's one thing that we have to recognize about authoritarian propaganda is that it works. So when democracies think about how to deal with, a lot of these overseas influence activities of authoritarian regimes, the first thing to do is not to bury your head in the sand and say, oh, this is all like fake news and propaganda. It is that, but it also works. So that's the problem. Iraq after the first Gulf War, excellent case study by Lisa Blades at Stanford. After the Gulf War, again, the U.S. imposed very harsh sanctions on Iraq, which greatly weakened the balance of payments of Iraq. But Saddam Hussein prevented massive capital flight and also drastically reduced benefits to all Sunnis and only maintained the extraordinary subsidies to people from the Tikrit area. That led to a rise of assassination attempts against Saddam, but because he was lucky or he had a good secret police or whatever, he survived these assassination attempts, and the regime kept on going until the U.S. invasion. Right, so that I think it's a classic case of literally the minimum winning coalition. When people throw that term around, it's like, show me 5 assassination attempts in 5 years, and I'll show you a minimum winning coalition. Until that happens, I just don't buy it. Right? Yeah. So China was the classic case of strong parties, strong institutions, and a short shock, which was the duration of the shock was controlled by the party itself. 2008, 2009 was a big shock, but China obviously just spent trillions and trillions of dollars to build infrastructure and smooth the economic growth. But now China is facing a prolonged period of slower growth, which I think politically will make it more interesting. I guess I'll leave it at that. If you guys want to have a discussion afterward, we can. So finally, implications for democracies. So in my studying of authoritarian regimes over the years, I've come to conclude a few things. One of them is that dictatorships, they face a very big fundamental deficiency, which is information asymmetry, right? So the different factions, if you will, different tendencies within the regime, they don't even know who each other are, and they don't know the relative distribution of power of each other. And that's a big weakness of dictatorship. So in democracies, because parties are open, we can just do an opinion poll, who's running ahead, whether it's Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or whatever. So all that is very public information. In dictatorships, you don't have this kind of information. But since editing this book and learning from all of my co-authors in this book, I've also come to realize that dictatorships have one big advantage vis-a-vis democracies, which is that it has complete flexibility in what kinds of coalitions it can form. Right, so if it can take benefits away from certain constituencies, if it needs to, there's no party system, there's Communist Party or whatever, but the party can shrink or enlarge, have an anti-corruption campaign at will, right? Someone here is studying that. Well, not at will, there are regularities, let's say, right? But it's somewhat within their discretion to do that, let's just say, right? And they can also do this overseas, right? So this includes flexibility to buy support in democracies with very few internal constraints against it and very little transparency. So they can, move $10 million into the bank account of some elected politician in a Western democracy from the Russian or the Chinese side, there's no constraint for them to do that. I mean, if they have a big enough bank account, they can do it, right? It's kind of a problem, hopefully, in Western democracies, but not from the authoritarian side. They can buy support coalitions until the cows come home if they want. So therefore, the democracies' responses also need to play to their strength, which is institutions and transparency. Right, so institutionally, law should be enacted to explicitly forbid authoritarian meddling in the election of public officials. So I think certainly that is the bottom line. As Comrade Xi Jinping likes to say, you always have to have a certain bottom line when you do things. And perhaps other forms of influence activities, right? So I think it's up to democracies to have a debate whether donating money to academic institutions, touches the bottom line. That's something that, often under discussion. And also, importantly, democracies have to endow police forces with the resources with which to enforce these laws. Whereas if the laws are only on the books, not going to do a lot of good. And then, of course, I think international collaboration to increase transparency on oligarchs who often are the middlemen. Unfortunately, mostly they're men, in authoritarian influence activities, right? So I think that there is only so many billionaires from China and Russia who can finance sizable overseas influence activities. If you just make all of them pretty transparent, it will take away some of the incentives for them to do this kind of stuff, because obviously if they're on a list of, being the henchmen of Putin or something like that, they run the risk of sanction, they run the risk of, not getting certain kinds of contracts when they want to do business overseas. So those are potential constraining factors. Anyway, again, thank you, Dan, for inviting me, and it was a great pleasure to do this book. And it's on Amazon, ready for pre-order, and it will be available sometime in January. Okay, thank you.
All right, we'll just wait 1 second. Do I have to do anything to put it up? No, okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, well, I'll echo my thanks also for Dan for inviting me to be here. I think I'm the only speaker who's not still in academia. So I feel a little bit like an outsider, but I have to say it's really fantastic to be back in an academic setting and on a university campus. What I'm talking about today is growing out of a project that I'm working on at the think tank in Washington, D.C., which is basically looking at how do we combat digital illiberalism, or combat digital authoritarianism. And so we're looking at the relationship between technology and autocracy to try to understand how it's shaping dynamics in autocracies. How are autocracies using it not just to kind of censor and control their populations, but are they using it in ways that can actually enhance the appeal of their model, for example, by mimicking elements of democracy, having some bottom-up participation, and kind of taking up some of the bottom-up pressure. So this is kind of based on some of the work I'm doing, and it's along with Joe Wright, who's at Penn State University, and Erica France at Michigan State. So that's what we're talking about today. But just really to take a step back quickly, I think we would all agree that if we look at the changes in the international environment in the last 10, 20 years, there's been tremendous changes, thinking about globalization, thinking about the rise of authoritarian powers like Russia and China, the growth of the internet, access to social media. All this has really dramatically shaped the context in which authoritarian regimes are operating. And I would say, it wasn't even more than 10 years ago that there were probably a lot of people who were arguing that these changes were going to benefit democracy. That certainly with the diffusion of power, for example, it would make it very hard for authoritarian regimes to be able to concentrate power and manage their authoritarian systems and rule. And so that these changes, the internet included, would be great democratizing forces, and that democracy was going to flourish. And so, but if you look around the globe, that's clearly not the picture that we see today. And I think that's why this question is so fantastic. We really have seen a tremendous amount of adaptation taking place in authoritarian regimes. And some of the work that I've been doing, let's see, which way do I go? This way. So I've done some work on kind of changes on the evolution of autocracy. So changes in how autocrats come to power, changes in how they maintain power, and changes in how they fall from power. And I want to spend most of my time just talking really about the latter two. And so if you look at how, so this is basically then painting a picture of how the threat perception from an autocrat's perspective has changed. And so this is some work that I did with Erica Frantz, published, I think, in the Washington Quarterly, that looks at changes in how autocrats exit office. And so first, there's basically three ways that autocrats can exit office. They can be removed due to actions of regime insiders, including through coups. They can be forced out of office through mass mobilization, so more of a bottom-up, and that would include revolts and civil wars. And they can die of natural causes. And so I think the thing that's notable about this, well, maybe I'll just say a couple of things. These regular changes that I've got here include exits at the hands of regime insiders that don't entail the use of force, elections in which incumbents use enforced term limits, resignations, and the consensus of regime insiders. And so each of those modes of departure require that elites are capable of constraining the decision and the behavior of leaders. So these are kind of inside regular changes. So what you see, though, is then kind of in this data, and I'll have one more slide after this that gives more data into the 2010s. But at the time that we published this, I mean, you can really see in the post-Cold War era a remarkable shift to the growth, the number or the proportion of autocrats who are being ousted through protests. So look back in between 1950 and 2012, there were 473 autocrats who lost power. And most of those were because of these insider-led exits, with coups being the most prevalent form of exit. And they were encompassed roughly 1/3 of all ousters since 1950. But the key takeaway, again, is that you see this increase in leader exits precipitated from the bottom up, in particular through protests. So in the 60s and 70s, in the 60s and 70s, only 5% of all authoritarian leaders were ousted in protests, and that's more than doubled. So between 2010 and 2012, it was 25%. And this is something, obviously that was shaped by the Arab Spring, but this is something that we've seen continue. So one reason this is happening is because there has been a very sharp decline in the number of coups in authoritarian regimes. There's been a number of scholars who have written about the decline of coups, particularly in Africa. And part of that is because we've also seen a decline in military dictatorships. So they used to make up 38% of all authoritarian regimes in the 40s, between 1940 and 1990. But today they're less than 10% of all autocracies. And coups, of course, were the most kind of common method of leader turnover in military dictatorships. So that has definitely changed. This will give you a little bit more of a snapshot. This is from work that I'm doing now with Joe and Erica. So this is from 2001 to 2017 leadership collapse events. And you can see, again, that the two most common ways that autocrats have lost power in this time period were through protests and elections. And while it is true that there's twice as many events in the election category, it's really important to note that a lot of these elections took place in a context of protest. So like in Guinea from 2008 to 2010, Mali 2012 to 2013, Egypt, all of these leaders agree to hold elections in the context of having massive numbers of people out on the street. So I think the key takeaway from this first part is the shift in the way that autocrats are exiting office. There still is a very real threat from regime insiders, but it is increasingly the case that I think people matter more and more in authoritarian settings. And so then authoritarian leaders are forced to adapt their tactics to maintain power. And so that's what we'll turn to now. And I'll get to this in a second. So changes in how autocrats are exiting office is then, so dictators are now responding and adapting. So one thing that we've seen as the number of or proportion of leaders who are ousted via protest has increased, we've also seen a concurrent increase in political and civil liberties restrictions around the world. And that makes sense because if you're a dictator and you used to believe that the most significant threat came from insiders around you, then you relied primarily on coup-proofing tactics like elite rotation and overpaying your security services and other ways to try to prevent coups. But as dictators are perceiving or understanding that they now face a threat from the masses, then they've started to pursue measures to try to make that collective action harder. Increasing political and civil liberties is one way that you can kind of frustrate the ability to mobilize and organize. But the thing that I want to talk about in this particular presentation then is how autocrats are using technology to address this threat. And so basically what we're going to talk about is seeing that autocrats are now using technology as a way to identify threats. That is, I think, increasing their durability in office. So it's reducing the risk of regime failure, and it's also reducing the incidence of protests. And I want to walk through some of that. But again, it's just, I think it's so interesting to step back and think about where we were just a decade ago, where we were believing that the internet and social media would be this great democratizing force. That was kind of the most pronounced in the early days of the Arab Spring, when you had people utilizing social media to orchestrate the ouster of 4 of the longest, or some very long-standing dictators in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. And now we see that dictators are they're actually co-opting these technologies to serve their own interests. They're deepening their grip internally, curbing basic human rights, spreading illiberal practices beyond their borders, and undermining trust in open societies. So this has become very much a co-opted tool that these leaders are now using to advance their own interests. Okay. But I think, so up until this point, and I think where I was in my process is, there's certainly been a lot of anecdotes with China's social credit system and a lot of storytelling, I think, about how autocrats are using technology, but there hasn't been any very kind of robust empirical evidence to actually demonstrate what kind of effect, how is it actually shaping outcomes in these regimes? And so that's the research that we wanted to try to push the button on a little bit. And so we utilized some new data out of the Varieties of Democracy data set. They've collected some new variables that measure a couple of different ideas. So we basically used this new data to create 2 new indices. One is a digital repression index, which measures a concept related to a state's behavior. It's how much do they actually repress in the digital sphere. So it includes things like social media censoring, social media monitoring, social media shutdown, internet filtering, and social media alternatives. So this is how much this is actually repression in practice. And then we created a separate index that measures capacity. And that's their capacity, a government's capacity to intervene in the digital sphere, and that is conceptually distinct, as we'll see, from a state's willingness to actually use those tools in practice. So with this slide, this is just some descriptive statistics that show kind of trends over time. And first of all, you can see that their use and both the capacity and the repression are increasing over time. Second, you can see, so on the left-hand side is democracies, on the right-hand side is dictatorships. You can see that obviously authoritarian regimes are using more digital repression than democracies, which we would expect because autocracies repress more than democracies. And I think third, you can see that the digital capacity outpaces digital repression in democracies. So the blue line, democracies have more capacity than they use. And the opposite is true in authoritarian regimes. They repress more than they have the capacity to do so. And part of that explanation might be their ability to purchase software and other surveillance things off the shelf from other more kind of advanced authoritarian regimes like China, but also the United States, Israel, other democracies are also exporting a lot of this software and allowing these countries to do even more than they might have the capacity to do on their own. Okay, so the first question we wanted to understand is their use of these digital technologies actually decreasing their risk of regime collapse? And to get at that, so we ran 3 different tests to try to understand and get at this idea. So test 1 is kind of comparing the average level of digital repression and capacity in regimes that collapsed and compared with those regimes that have yet to collapse. during the period 2000 to 2017. And you can see on the left, the average for those that survive is 0.4. The average for those that collapse is negative 0.49, which is a statistically significant difference. Then on the right panel, this is with digital repression. So that's capacity, it's repression. It's a similar story. Those that survive, the average was 0.86. Those that collapse, 0.25. And again, that was a statistically significant difference. So from this test, we would conclude that yes, these digital tools are reducing the risk of regime failure. So then we did another test, which basically is a pooled approach. So we're comparing, and this is the one on the left. The one on the left is the pooled. So we're comparing across countries in this test. And basically what we see is that it lowers the regime risk of regime collapse from 1% to 2%. And although that sounds relatively small, when you look at the baseline risk in any given year, it's only 3.7. So it's actually quite a it's a substantive effect. It's basically making a regime's risk of failure decline from 3.7% to 1.8. So there is something there. But where we ran into some problems was when we did fixed effects. So we were looking at a country's use of the technology, both the capacity and their actual repression over time, and did that change its risk of failure? And there we didn't find statistically significant results. So we're still trying to think through about, how to interpret the results. That's obviously a more kind of rigorous and higher, more difficult test. And it could have something to do with how short our time period is. So it's kind of, I think we're a little bit open on trying to figure out how to interpret this. So then the second question, though, we wanted to look at then is if protest is one of the biggest threats to authoritarian regimes, does their use of digital technology actually decrease the incidence of protest? And to do that, we use our same two indicators and then data on protests from the Mass Mobilizations Data Project. Oops, sorry. There we go. And here again, so the first one on the left, we use a binary indicator of protest, which is basically akin to a survival model. Like, did they have protest or did they not? But it also counts the time, it's adjusted for the time since the last protest. So it is very much like a survival model. And the second one is a count of protests in a given year. And so the idea here was like with the binary indicator, it helps us understand whether digital repression deters or prevents protests from starting. And then the second measure, which is a more continuous measure, is more likely to capture whether large, sustained protest movements like the Arab Spring are likely to emerge. And in both cases, you can see we're below zero, so it's reducing the risk that you see these protests in any given year. And this obviously had other controls and other things in it, but I don't want to get into all of the details. And then the final thing we looked at is whether or not using digital repression allowed dictators to decrease their use of hard repression. So using hard repression carries costs. It can elicit backlash. There's all sorts of costs associated with an authoritarian's use of hard repression. So then the question is, well, can you use these digital technologies to replace repression? That would be one hypothesis. Alternatively, you could imagine that a dictator's use of these digital tools allows them to kind of hone and use repression in a more targeted sense. So by being able to identify the dissidents online or being able to use surveillance technologies, well, now you can actually reduce the risks that you incur with more indiscriminate use of protest and continue to use the repression, but just in a much more targeted manner. And that is what we actually found, is that they are complements to each other. So those authoritarian regimes that use digital repression were more likely to also use hard repression. So that's kind of all I have to present. But I think it's just, again, going back to why this is such a great question, is trying to be able to understand how authoritarianism is evolving over time. We do see these changes in how they're exiting. We see changes in the tools they're using to maintain power. We see changes in how they're coming to power. And if we don't understand that, if we fail to grasp that, then any policies that we develop to try to counter authoritarianism or kind of put democracy on a better foot are going to be unsuccessful if we're not kind of cognizant of these changes. So I will end there.
Well, I'm really pleased to be able to join this group because I've actually learned something already, and the country I work on, Angola, sort of exemplifies what Andrea just talked about, with a lot of monitoring of the internet and social media, and combining that with other repressive organizations and efforts. But actually what I'm going to talk about is their effort to provide goods, so the kind of other side of the repression equation. So thanks for having me. So I want to also situate my work more in an urban context. The growth of urban areas has been one of the key developments of the 20th and the 21st centuries. In the last 50 years, the share of the population in Nepal and Mali, for example, living in urban areas has quadrupled, and in Nigeria and Kenya, it's tripled. By 2050, most of the world's population will be living in cities. So rapid urbanization and a parallel growth in the middle class and a rise in the number of educated people has increased the pressure on democratic and authoritarian regimes to deliver goods and services such as water, housing, health, electricity, and education. Not surprisingly, scholars have also taken a great interest in why and when governments deliver services and who benefits. So that's where my intervention is. I'm examining the responses of urban residents to the delivery of multiple services by a long-standing authoritarian regime. Much of the research on goods delivery, regardless of regime type, constructs delivery of goods as a kind of exchange. Governments deliver goods in exchange for votes if they're democracies, or in exchange for loyalty or at least indifference if they're authoritarian. That's what the theory, the conventional claim, generally tells us. Now, a famous example of this is Margaret Thatcher. Of course, it was a democracy, or sort of. Margaret Thatcher delivering a council house to these occupants and making them homeowners. She was trying to create a homeowning democracy, but she wanted something in return. She expected that that the recipients of these council houses who would become new homeowners would vote for the Conservative Party. Just to jump to the punchline, that kind of backfired on her. Now, for authoritarian regimes, a kind of similar idea prevails, that they'll give people goods, and that's supposed to make them co-opted by the government, or at least indifferent to the authoritarian restrictions that prevail. Now, the Arab Spring kind of rattled these assumptions and called into question the political payoffs from the distribution of goods. Some of the participants in the protests that eventually toppled regimes in Tunisia and Egypt had received education, housing, water, and other services from those regimes, which suggests that either efforts to co-opt those people didn't work or they didn't last. Moreover, a recent study by Blattman, Emerial, and Fiala found that despite having received cash grants to start businesses, young, poor voters in semi-autocratic Uganda increased their support for the opposition rather than the incumbent government. So the authors tentatively conclude that increased financial independence freed up participants to make their own political choices, and they chose to vote for the opposition. So this seems to be more consistent with the claims of modernization theory. You provide people a few basic goods, and then they start thinking about higher order political goods. So these mixed findings have kind of prompted our hypothesis. And that is that maybe goods have a political life cycle. Maybe they work for a while, and then it wears off. So one of our arguments is that perhaps as governments supply more of a good in question, the marginal returns from delivering the good decline. People shift their priorities to something else they want, or to say it more simply, gratitude has a short shelf life. You can't buy love. So we developed this argument by looking at a rare survey of low and middle income urban residents in Angola to examine the relationship between an individual's experiences of goods provided under an authoritarian regime and their evaluations of government policy performance with respect to these goods. Now, the study wasn't able to determine the voting intentions of respondents following the delivery of goods. I mean, that would be great if we could ask people that, but it's an authoritarian regime, and not only would we not have gotten the survey approved if we asked people who they voted for, but also we didn't want to compromise the people we were interviewing. We didn't want to jeopardize their situation by asking them direct political questions. But we were able to ask them whether they had access to goods, whether they were satisfied with the goods that they received, and then we asked them more general questions about what did they think about how the government was performing with regard to housing policy or electricity policy. So we moved between their individual situation and a broader assessment of how the government was performing. I think that our work has a number of advantages over previous work. One of the advantages is that, in contrast to a lot of studies that examine only one good, our study examined a portfolio of many goods, 5 goods in particular: housing, electricity, water, healthcare, and education. And we looked at them in various stages of their life cycles. Secondly, the study included respondents from different socioeconomic backgrounds residing in different kinds of urban neighborhoods. We had people living in a poor, very poor neighborhood that was located in the city center, and we also included people who were living in new neighborhoods. One, a holistically planned mega city that was created with the support of the Chinese. So we sampled a variety of neighborhoods to conduct our study, and very few studies on authoritarian countries have been able to engage in this kind of systematic work. And frankly, I think we got lucky, and we won't ever be able to do it again in Angola. So let me tell you a little bit about Angola. Angola is a resource-rich, middle-income developing country that shares a lot of similarities with countries in the Middle East, as well as autocracies in the rest of Africa. It's ruled by the same party that took power at independence in 1975, the Movement for the Liberation of Angola. It does have parties, and it does have elections, but these are highly controlled and manipulated by the ruling party, and it's not going to lose anytime soon. Like other resource-rich authoritarian countries, it distributes goods. So here's a map of it. It's in West Africa, and you see at the top there Luanda. That's the capital city. A quarter of the population lives there, and that's what I'm mainly focusing on. That's where those neighborhoods are. So like many authoritarian countries, the Angolan government distributed goods for two reasons. One, they were getting a lot of discontent about the poor housing conditions and the shortages of electricity and water and education. So they were distributing those goods in response to the discontent. But at the same time, they also expected that if they do that, then people will shut up and that they will get favorable evaluations of their performance. And they've been doing a lot. So they concluded a civil war in 2002. So that's their protection pact, to use Dan's words. And they've been shoring that up since 2002 with a provision pact. So this is a kind of geocoded data that I put together with some of my students. And at this scale, you can't really see the magnitude of what they've done, but they've created 200 different residential projects. Some of these residential projects are 20,000 units, so built for 100,000 people. Some of them are much smaller and built basically for government ministers. But each one of these dots represents a different residential community built for a different group of people. There's been just a massive residential building boom. They completely redid the Bay of Luanda here, right in the central business district, with Chinese and Brazilian support. They also created a new legislative building. You can see what that's modeled off of. So the symbolic performance of power is very important to this regime. They've also distributed electricity, sanitation, schools, water, housing. There was a billboard that I showed you right at the beginning of the presentation that was advertising all the housing. They have billboards all over the city reminding you, in case you forget, who the benefactor is. So they're really trying to sell this idea that they are the provider of goods, even though they're getting a lot of help from the workers of other countries. Okay, so then we wanted to know, like, is this working? You know, Angolans grumble a lot all the time, and they complain bitterly about the services. So after this effort to provide services was in operation for about a decade, we decided to see if we could do a survey. So I teamed up with some Angolans to do a public opinion survey. It was one of the first surveys in the country. There's been no census since 1970. So this speaks to the information asymmetries that exist in authoritarian countries. They did finally do a census, but released very little information about what the census actually found, other than to say that a quarter of the population, about 7 million people, live in Luanda. So we purposely sampled 5 of those neighborhoods, and as I mentioned, so here's where all the neighborhoods were. So some of these are new developments for poor people. Some of them are new developments for middle class people. Some of them are older settled neighborhoods. Particularly the one close to Luanda is an older, poor, settled neighborhood. And these kind of show you what the different ones look like. The one that is called Kilamba is 20,000 units of varying heights. And when I showed it to my colleague Yuan Ang, she said, "I didn't know you'd been to China." Well, I haven't. It was designed by the Chinese and modeled on a city in China. Okay, so we looked at who's received goods, what the levels of access are, what the degrees of satisfaction were, and finally whether access or satisfaction were associated with approval of government performance. We kind of snuck the performance indicators in the back of the survey and somehow got through the sensors. So these are just some of the characteristics of the respondents. Again, like some of this data, like no one knew any of this because there's been so few surveys done in Angola. More now, but at that time, 4 years ago, very little. So basically, this is kind of summarizing our dependent variable. I'm not going to show you a bunch of the regressions, but we did, there is something to notice here. First of all, in terms of how well or very well the government's doing performing with regard to policies on housing and education, it's under 50%. So less than 50% of the respondents, the nearly 400 respondents, thought the government was doing well or very well. We've got a lot of variation here otherwise that we exploit to make our claim about the life cycle, but also to notice that with regard to healthcare, they've just performed really badly on that measure. So what we find is that in the aggregate, favorable experiences of goods provision are positively associated with favorable evaluations of government performance across all 5 goods. So in other words, what the larger regressions show us is that if you've had a good experience with electricity, either accessing it or you are satisfied with the quality of electricity, then you also tend to rate the government favorably with regard to their performance. So those results did suggest that the government derives political payoffs from improved service delivery in the sense of getting positive evaluations. But when we went to the individual level, it turned out that favorable experiences translate really unevenly into favorable evaluations of government. Individuals' own experiences affect their evaluations least for goods at the beginning of the cycle, so that would be demonstrated by health care, where there's, in terms of the life cycle of health care, they just haven't given much. But it also affects their evaluations at the end of a life cycle. So when governments give a lot of stuff, like electricity, the individual's experiences don't seem to affect their evaluations. So when aggregate provision is lowest and when it's highest, it's not affected by people's personal experiences. So what we found is that for intermediate levels of aggregate provision, which in our survey were water and education, that's when individuals' own experiences most strongly cue their evaluations of government performance. So what does this? What do these findings tell us? Well, we think that what they illustrate is that even citizens living under an authoritarian regime, first of all, that they differentiate among goods in evaluating government performance, and they show variation that's broadly consistent with our hypotheses about political life cycles. Ironically, citizens seem to be most favorable towards goods when governments are most ambivalent about providing them, and ironically least favorable not only at the beginning, but also at the end of a good's life cycle. And this paradox, we think, might explain why even beneficiaries of government provision why even beneficiaries of government provision participated in protests during the Arab Spring. And I should note also, so that's kind of consistent with your claim, Andrea, about the increase in protests, but we've also seen in the Angolan situation that Luanda, which has benefited the most from goods delivery, also voted against the government in the 2017 election. So the ruling party lost in Luanda, which has been the greatest beneficiary of goods provision. So, okay, so even though we're claiming that governments derive declining marginal returns from goods provision, providing goods might still accomplish what Albertus, Finner, and Slater term coercive distribution. Coercive distribution accomplishes, I think, in this sense, two goals. First of all, it enmeshes recipients and networks of dependence, which is what Albertus, Finner, and Slater claimed. But I think it also undercuts the organizational capacity of potentially troublesome adversaries. I think because providing goods at least buys indifference, and that's sort of all you need under an authoritarian regime, as long as you have all these other coercive mechanisms in place, which is what the Angolan government does. They also monitor the internet extensively, but they will also take you behind the schoolhouse and shoot you if you cause too much trouble, and everyone knows that. So I will end there.
So I'll come around with the microphone. I'll take Dan's cue.
Hi, thank you for such really inspiring presentations. I guess I'll just ask the question about Angola, since it was the last presentation that's really on my mind. I'm wondering if distribution doesn't work very well for generating political support, because it's not really quid pro quo. It's not really distributed in exchange for political support. So it's basically provision of public goods rather than provision of goods to supporters that would be conditional. And I'm wondering if you know of any cases of this conditional support in Angola, and if they may be different.
Yeah, well, certainly Angola also has that, where the government targets the provision of, for example, access to lucrative businesses, or provides better housing to government ministers or jobs for supporters. So certainly Angola also has that more targeted provision, but usually as a reward for support and for demonstrated support. You know, so they do have that. In this instance, it is a public good, but even with public goods, you have to make choices about where you're going to provide them. I mean, they could have provided the public goods somewhere else, but they chose Luanda, and Luanda is where they've had much of their discontent since the end of the civil conflict in 2002. So they've made it clear that they were hoping to receive support, and I think in particular they targeted those areas where they detected that they could potentially lose in the 2017 elections. So between the 2012 elections and 2017 elections, they made it an explicit part of party policy that they would provide housing because they were worried about losing support in Luanda. And in fact, it did not provide those results. If I could tie individual votes to the receipt of goods, I think I could make that case more strongly, but I can't.
I wanted to actually take, if I could take just a step back and kind of focus back on the theme of adaptation as I was listening to all three presentations. And it just sort of occurred to me so why do authoritarian regimes need to adapt? And what are some kind of common themes that seem to come through? And it seemed to me there are a couple of reasons. One is that these regimes exist against a backdrop of economic and technological change. So these things are changing globally. This is not something that is really under their control, but so they need to adapt to that in some manner. And also, I think this really came through in Anne's presentation, I think, and Andrea's as well in particular, but I think there's a way in which over time, with those economic changes, with economic development, it's not so much, I think, that economic development produces more democratic citizens, but it produces more demanding citizens, right? And so as you're seeing higher demands for performance. And so as I was thinking about this, it sort of occurred to me, one way to think about the problem of adaptation is to say, it can mean two different things. One way you could adapt is by saying, well, we have to do what we do better. So I'm adapting by improving my performance at what I've always done. But another way to think about adaptation is to say, I need to do something fundamentally new. I actually need to take on new practices and new. So this could take very tangible form in Anne's paper, where you could say, well, over time, maybe, well, we were happy with these goods, but now we want different. We want you to provide different things, better things. Or it could be, well, we've gotten used to such and such a standard, we want a higher standard of the same thing. But I wonder if that resonates, or if we can think about this, and maybe for the whole conversation, whether we can think about adaptation more about taking on different tasks, or simply performing old tasks in better fashion. I don't know if that resonates for any of you, if you want to take a stab. But.
Well, I mean, I think I'll let Andrea also follow up, because I was very inspired by your presentation, which also, goes along with a lot of stuff that I've read by Dan about, I think this use, on the theme of adaptation, the use of electronic media to both filter out unwanted news from around the world, and also to channel the messages that you want your population to believe in. That is very revolutionary, and it happened without certainly us political scientists really realizing it until it has happened already. I mean, it has happened, right? Not only in countries that pioneer these techniques like China and Russia, but it's spreading around the world, right? Through this sort of commercialization of a lot of these software packages and so on and so forth. Of course, social media has had the opposite effect in some places. But I think that's sort of the early wave. Now that the censorship technology, the ability to have fake online campaigns about this and that has increasingly been perfected, the opposite impact will begin to be felt, not just in China and Russia, but also around the world.
I think we've had this conversation too about whether or not these digital tools are something new. I mean, certainly the tools are new, but they're using them to do the same things that they've always done. So it's kind of like an amplification and an acceleration of some tried and true practices that they've always done. And so that's, some people are calling it digital authoritarianism. I think we've had a discussion about whether, is that right? Is this a new form of authoritarianism, or is this just authoritarianism with, on steroids is a silly way to put it, but it just is making autocrats more capable at doing what they've always done. I think that's one way that I've thought about it. But one thing this makes me think about too is, you had, and I agree with you about one of the biggest vulnerabilities of autocracies is this information asymmetry. And, it's the dictator's dilemma that they can't, their publics aren't especially legible, they can't read discontent. People around them aren't willing to pass along bad information. It happens in China, it definitely happens in Russia. But the question now in my mind is then, does technology enable them to overcome that dilemma? That now that they don't have to depend on these traditional channels of kind of intelligence gathering within their own society, so to speak, and if they can gather the big data and all of these new things that they can do, does that make their societies more legible and enable them to target what they need to do more effectively? Is technology going to help them overcome this information asymmetry? And Anne, as you were talking to, it's the same thing. You're talking about where they provided public goods, they had to make choices. But now, will they make better choices? Do they understand, will they be able to more effectively calibrate the distribution and the withholding of public goods, because now that they have a better sense of actually what's happening in their societies. And so like at the very broadest level, I mean, we've always said democracies outperformed authoritarian regimes because there was a diffusion of power. It was more efficient when you can push many decisions out across many people. And authoritarianism was not efficient because how could you possibly centralize all of that information and expect that people would make good choices? But now, does technology overcome that? And so, those are, I think, the really important questions that we have to start figuring out.
Right, because, if I can use technology to figure out that the Angolan government has built 200 residential projects in the last decade, then they can use technology too. I'm using satellite imagery and geocoding land values and size of projects because I can count from the air. Well, so can they. Yeah. That's enabling them to get more information. But I think that you raise a really good point, which speaks to why I find this idea of coercive distribution so seductive. Because when I think it's hard to operationalize, if it's not about land reform, I think it's a little hard to operationalize. But what I find seductive about it is that, even if these people who got goods are indifferent about them or forget about them later, nevertheless, the government now knows like who they gave access to, who got a house. Housing is particularly critical. They know who got the house. And secondly, what about all those people who didn't get housing, who now see, wow, these people got government-financed loans for 3% to buy really nice houses in Quilamba, or those people got houses for free from the government. They also get enmeshed in the networks of dependence because they want to be next on the list. So maybe the distribution isn't about what happens to these people after they get goods. That is one group, but it's these people who didn't get them who now know if you don't behave, you're not going to get these goods.
I have a question. I have two questions. One question is about Victor's use of the idea of coalition changes, and I want to relate it to some of the things that that Andrea also talked about. So I wanted you to also expand a little bit on this post-2015. You say China had a longer-term shock. I assume 2015 is because of the stock market crash and
the foreign exchange market, more importantly.
And the foreign exchange. Okay,
Yeah.
and then talk about the coalition change and whether or not having a single-party regime makes coalition changes easier. Is that one reason why we say we think single-party regimes might be more resilient? Because the Chinese Communist Party obviously has changed a lot in terms of its membership over time, and so it seems like that would make it easier for the ruler or the ruling coalition or the smaller group at the very top to make adjustments in who supports them, as opposed to a military regime or a personalistic regime. So that's one question, just about relating this coalition switch to these regime types. The question I have, the second one is for Anne about. So I just briefly on the survey results, it seems as if the Angolan government performs poorly, more poorly in areas like health and education and better in kind of hard infrastructure. So I want to relate this to China since you mentioned so much of it is coming from with help from the Chinese government. Does that mean that Angolans actually have a more positive view of China? Because the things that China is helping to provide, I'm assuming, are things like housing and electricity, and they're not very involved in things like health and education.
Right.
Go ahead.
You want
Oh,
me to, you go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sure. So on coalition, yeah, so I agree with you. I think one aspect of authoritarian parties that might have been sort of underemphasized by a lot of the existing literature is exit options, which is that, so a lot of, just some of the conversations that we've all had in China, everyone hates Xi Jinping, or at least his policies. Within the Chinese government, they're grumbling, I can't even get these coupons to get a discount during Chinese New Year, can't even Although Mao Tai's back in, so maybe that's not so bad anymore. But you can drink the liquor sometimes. So a lot of grumbling, but then you ask, well, why don't you just not, leave the party? Or the problem in single party regimes is even in nominally multi-party regimes where the opposition parties are very weak or whatever, at least there's some kind of option where you can leave the dominant party, join the opposition. In China, that's very difficult. I mean, you either become an enemy of the regime, and the cost we know is extremely high. The party makes it its business. And so I think in those kinds of regimes, intuitively, it feels like you can reduce benefits to them to a large extent. I mean, if you think about what the Chinese government has done in the past 6-7 years, it has been this process of, using gradually heated water to cook a frog. So this is a Chinese saying, 温水煮青蛙, right? Like, and the frog is being cooked, and the frog being Chinese government officials. I mean, they used to have all kinds of gray incomes. The kids could all study overseas. They could travel overseas easily to visit their kids, to go on vacation, buy properties in Hong Kong, buy properties, overseas in California. Doing any of these things now is extremely high risk and potentially very costly for them. So their level of welfare has been reduced by, I would say at least sort of 60, 70%. I mean, there's still this ideological payoff, if you will, of Xi Jinping's thinking, which is a reward on its own. But besides that, a lot of the material benefits have been taken away, and yet we don't see any signs of increasing opposition activities. Partly is the surveillance state is so complete. And by the way, I mean, that's a very interesting point, is that the technology should replace the human dimension of, spying on your own people, but it hasn't. I mean, by all accounts, I mean, if you look at what's happening in Xinjiang, and I tell people, from China, there was a PLA general who visited UCSD recently. I told her, I'm like, why do you need to have young Han Chinese sleep in the homes of, hundreds of thousands of Uyghur families at a time? It's completely unnecessary. You know everything about them already. I mean, just install a freaking camera in their home if you want. I mean, why do you need actual people to live, to be relatives, in their homes for weeks at a time? But the problem is that the party always asks for no gaps, right? No gaps. And the threshold for no gap keeps on rising as the technology gets better. So no gap used to be like, oh, well, we just send a few thugs to look at dissidents, that's enough. But now it's like, oh, anyone who's tweeting about, bad things, they all get monitored, and so on and so forth. I mean, that's the nature of totalitarian regime, is that it will never satisfy. No amount of surveillance will satisfy them. Anyway.
Yes, so the question was about what they have and haven't provided. So yes, they have provided, what we call kind of on-site services, and they've been better at that thanks to the support of the Chinese. They've been very bad about healthcare, and I think basically it's because of the nature of healthcare. It's just harder to import a bunch of trained doctors and to get all the technology that they need. And as long as very wealthy Angolans can get on a flight and go to South Africa for medical treatment, that relieves some of the pressure in that area. But it really, troubles people a lot. And when I've run my regressions, I can run attitudes towards healthcare against almost any other measure, and there's a relationship. I mean, healthcare really seems to drive a lot of discontent. When I've given this paper in Angola in the past, I can hardly get through that slide where I show the attitudes on healthcare, because they all want to talk about healthcare. So how does this affect their view of the Chinese? I mean, it's mixed. It's less They dislike the Chinese less than their next door neighbor, Zambia, which is particularly hostile to China, partly because politicians in Zambia have demonized China, but also because Zambian trade was really undercut by Chinese traders. So, but in Angola, the problem is that all these deals the government made in order to build all these new gated communities involved bringing workers from China and Vietnam. So Angolans are pretty angry that they didn't get those jobs. And particularly now, it's an oil-driven economy. So with the drop in the price of oil since 2014, Angolans' demands for work have increased, and that has shaped, I think, views of China. But the work is I don't know, pretty well done, and also came in ahead of schedule, and Angolans are really impressed by that.
I think we have time for one more.
So just bringing things back to the consequences of technology and adaptation. When Dan was sort of asked the sort of refocusing question, the ensuing discussion, we talked about the dictator's dilemma and the informational problems that technology may or may not solve. And so I think based on the discussion so far, people have talked a lot about how technology facilitates the monitoring of the masses, but the other element of the dictator's dilemma is you don't know who, in your immediate, in your immediate neighborhood at the Politburo meeting is secretly plotting to, have you whacked. And so the thing that's interesting to me about that is that probably technology is not going to solve that problem. And so you would expect. So I wonder if it's reasonable to, in sort of data collection efforts like the one you guys have going on, so we saw maybe the first peak of technology being associated with mass uprisings and mass removals from office. Do you think that in the future that trend is actually going to go down, and you'll see a resurgence of, as a function of or as a percentage of the authoritarian removals, you're going to see them more being sort of coups, and I wonder if that is a reasonable interpretation of the conversation.
Yeah, I think that, that's a really good question. I think that's in part, it's like it is very much, it feels like a cat and mouse game, right? So there's some sort of innovation, and then that puts authoritarian regimes on the back foot, and then they adapt to kind of respond to that crisis. And then there'll be some sort of new innovation that then they'll have to respond to. So, I very much agree that we could kind of see this ebb and flow. But it is important, I think. The way that I think of the technology is it's very much neutral. It's a tool that oppositionists have. It is a tool that facilitates collective action. I think that's one reason, in my understanding of why we have seen so many more protests, is because we know, and why we've seen more protests unseating dictators, is because of technology. It does facilitate collective action in an important way. It doesn't mean that what you get next is going to be a democracy, but it does facilitate collective action. And we know that when it comes to unseating leaders, the size of a protest matters, and social media can get people out on the street. So I think your point is exactly right. It is something that, I had wondered then after the Arab Spring, would we see this trend continue or not? Would there be some sort of adaptation? So, I think it almost, though, that it turns into like a very messy thing. Like, are we then set for a trend or a period of time where we will just see more volatility and turnover as you kind of have adaptation, response, innovation, adaptation, kind of this kind of cycle, and will it just become much more turbulent? It's also important to, these protests and things are happening in democracies too, and so I don't know. This is just a really kind of uncertain time, and it feels like it's going to be a bumpy ride.
I think another wrinkle here is that, sometimes removal by coup can look like a removal by protest.
Yeah.
If we think about what just happened in Bolivia.
Yeah.
And so it's certainly the case too that even if protests lead to removal, in a lot of cases, protests are largely generated by some kind of elite leadership, some kind of elite defection. And so to the extent that that's true, so the technology might be good for some kind of bubbling up protest, but might not be so good when what's really going on is that elites are, basically they switch, they manage to use their resources to mobilize these kind of protests, and you get more of these hybrid kind of events when the elites are clearly doing the removing, but part of how they legitimize it in a lot of ways is you get a crowd behind them. So, and that's going to make it tough for you guys to code these things.
We were just this earlier. It's getting harder and harder to disentangle these things. I mean, like almost every protest has at the end there's some sort of elite intervention. The security services basically have to say we're not going to fire on protesters or we're not going to protect you from these crowds. So then there's that data on the kind of leader exit is by a political scientist, Milan Svalek, and so he has some coding rules about even if the kind of straw that broke the camel's back is some sort of security services intervention, if there were massive amounts of people on the streets, it's still coded as a protest event. But it's getting so messy.
Yeah, but that might be what they need to adapt to.
Yeah.
Is precisely these kind of pincers sort of events when you both face this combination of protest and elite. And so
At the same
maybe that's
time.
happening in new ways that will be the next stage of adaptation, perhaps. But terrific. I think we're out of time. So thank you. This was really, I thought, a great conversation. And thanks so much for coming out. So
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.